Welcome to this week's Experiments and Explorations artist lecture. Before I get into our guest for today, I just wanted to let people know that next week we will be returning after a lot of this visual art back to sound, and we're having the musician, composer, and appropriation artist John Lydecker, who's better known as Wobbly, who is a sound artist who really works between experimental and avant-garde music and pop music, and he's has done collaborations with many musicians from both the pop and rock world and the avant-garde, including Negative Land, Dieter Mobius, Fred Frith, Sina Parkins, and others. People in the East Bay may know his radio show, Over the Edge, at KPFA, so he also has a regular show, and he'll be talking about a lot about appropriation as well. So that's next Wednesday. But today we have with us Jim Campbell, who's really one of the most important media artists who has defined Bay Area experimental media art in a lot of ways. And he received degrees in the math and sciences before coming to art, and he has degrees in engineering and mathematics from MIT. And his work has been about combining art, science, and technology, first in filmmaking in the 1980s, and then into interactive video installations, and his custom electronic sculptures and installations have made him a leading figure in the use of computer technology as an art form. And his most recent work, which he'll talk about, I think he'll talk about all of this, is working with light and LED grids. His work has been shown internationally and throughout North America and Europe. His electronic artwork is included in collections at the Whitney Museum, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, here at the Berkeley Art Museum, and the list goes on and on. In 1992, he created one of the first permanent public interactive video artworks in the US in Phoenix, Arizona. And as an engineer, he holds more than a dozen patents in the field of video image processing and has lectured on interactive video all over the country. His recent public art commissions are numerous and include Madison Square Park Conservancy in New York, and a piece called Scattered Light. In 2010 to 13, the San Diego County Regional Airport Authority installation. From 2010 to 17, he created a reflecting ribbon in the San Francisco Central Subway and Union Square Station, and most recently he has a permanent installation that's about to come online at the top of the brand new Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. The artwork will be located at the crown of the tower and will be illuminated nightly and will be able to be seen all over the area. So he'll be talking about these and other work. So join me in welcoming Jim Campbell.
Sorry, my computer went to sleep here. Thanks, Jeffrey. My background is, as Jeffrey said, engineering. I worked in Silicon Valley on and off for 25 years. And about 30 years ago, I started drifting into art. Very early on, I was working maybe a couple days a month doing art, and it took me, I think, 20 years before I started doing art full time, and I was able to support myself with art. I'm going to show work from the last 30 years, snippets here and there. And I was thinking on the way here, one of the things to think about when you're looking at this fairly long span of technology art is, does it still hold up? And I think that's an interesting question with technology art. One of the things that I tried to do early on was to create works that were not about the technology, but used the technology. And when you're in the middle of it, it's actually really hard to tell whether you're kind of breaking the ground of just displaying some aspect of the technology versus going beyond. And so my kind of rule of thumb is if it works 10 years later still, then it was successful in that regard in terms of being more than just about the coolness of new technology. Can I get the lights dimmed so that I can be a little darker? So this was actually the first electronic artwork that I made, and it was from a series of works that were on the theme of mental illness. This work was shown at SF MoMA, New York. That's what you're seeing here. And essentially I wanted to create a work that would make people feel, even if just for a moment, what it would be like to be mentally ill. And in other words, I wanted to actually really upset people. I had no art school training, so this notion of kind of preconceived setup for the audience wasn't really something that I thought about early on. I didn't mind just creating something to upset people. From what you can see from the documentation in that regard, the work was a complete failure in that people were more interested in seeing themselves than anything else and waving at the camera. It's almost like they didn't even see the flames. And so one of the things, this is actually the second version of the work that I did, which also has this virtual woman in the space who existed on Laserdisc at the time. And based on the outcome of what her coin flip, for example, that would affect the fire. Another thing that I did to try to get people to look beyond the mirror effect, the wave at the camera, was that I would freeze their image on the screen even after they left, so that there was no longer that immediate feedback of waving at the camera. This was probably the most sophisticated work I've done to date, and it was the first work that I made. I had to come up with a way of eliminating the background and just putting fire over people. At the time, I estimated on the way here, it probably would have taken about 30 computers to do this work, but I did it with custom electronics. And now, of course, you could do this on an iPhone, which is a little depressing. I spent about a year on it with the technology. And
Heads.
This actually turned out to upset people more than being on fire. It was just to see themselves go away. And lastly, I'm showing the way that a couple people kind of chose to interact with the virtual woman in the space. And she actually wasn't responding to, she was just doing her own thing, so that was kind of a coincidence. But I learned a lot about interactivity and people's attention span from this work. I studied, I have about 8 hours of documentation that I looked at for future works. This next work was kind of the beginning of my fascination with using computer memory in very simple ways as analogies for human memory. It's called memory recollection, and it would capture your image in the left-hand screen and gradually fade to the right, getting noisier and noisier as it did. So your image would kind of dissolve to noise as kind of a cartoon strip. But the work also had a 10 megabyte hard drive hooked up to it, which would capture images every now and then and store them and intersperse the historical images with the present images. So the work has probably shown in about 20 locations, and so it keeps track of its own history. When it goes to a new location, you see where it's been, but you also see the present. Problem with this work is it used CRT tubes for the TVs, and they have essentially gone bad, and I'm running out of spares. And it would be a very different work with small LCD screens. And that's obviously a problem in general for technology art and keeping it to date without drastically changing the essence of the work. This is another work that deals with time and memory. It's a combination of a 5-second delay in the watch face and real time outside the watch face. So as you walk up to the work, you see a few seconds later yourself walking up to the work. And it allows you to kind of go back and forth between these two kind of time frames. One of them being delayed, but also discrete time, once a second, based on the second hand of the clock. And again, here's documentation that I did where I would kind of look at how people would try to figure out what it was that they were looking at. I did a whole series of works. I've shown 2 or 3 here that really I saw as psychological mirrors, creating feedback systems that would kind of force viewers to look at themselves differently than they normally would. This was the first public art project that I created that was in the Phoenix Sun Sports Arena in Arizona for, I think, 12 years before they decommissioned it and put up statues of basketball players, I think. And I wanted to do a video work, but I also didn't want to do a video loop, so I used the same technology that I showed earlier that would capture people's imagery and superimpose it on top of still images, in this case columns from southern Italy and Greece, that I superimposed onto the kind of onto the monitors that were covering the real columns in the space. So I created this kind of these virtual columns that you could only see yourself in front of when you moved. It was a way of eliminating the Taco Bell and McDonald's from the imagery, which I thought would have kind of ruined the notion of the work. But the work layered all of the imagery that you're seeing in real time, and part of the point of that was kind of using the laws of combinatorics. I didn't want a work that would repeat itself, so it was always changing because it had 100 images that it could superimpose on top of each other at any time. along with the live images. And I also had a camera in the bowl for a while until they realized that the opposing team could watch the local team practice. That would superimpose imagery onto the basketball, from the basketball court also. This work is actually in the collection of the museum here, and after creating interactive work for, I guess, 7 years at this point, I kind of got bored with it and looked at what interactive work typically did at the time, and what it typically did was it gave you what you wanted. You would walk up to something and it would do something for you, and then you'd be happy and you'd go away. So I created a couple works that were dedicated to kind of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. This is one of them, and what it is this Buddha in this glass cube, but the closer you get to the cube, the more it fogs up. Because it's lit from the inside, instead of seeing the Buddha when you get close, you see the shadow of the Buddha as projected onto the outside of the cube. This was a good example of it taught me a lesson, which was that for these kinds of works where you're working with interactivity and frustrating people, you want to make sure that there are kind of no tricks that people can use to actually figure them out. So for example, for this one, people would crawl up to the work, or they would run up to the work, or kind of inch on the wall as close as they could get. But there was a camera on the ceiling that would figure out where they were no matter where they were. And similar work also dedicated to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is a projected image, a life-size image onto a bed of salt at the end of a dark hallway. And as you approached this image, it would zoom in to the point of abstraction. So the more that you wanted to see this image of these two figures embracing, the less you would see. And up until this point, I used a lot of randomness in my work, and this was the first work that I used, I guess I called it at the time kind of a big word for it, but subliminal interactivity. And as a person would walk up to these two figures on the bed, it would actually zoom in to the point that they would walk towards. So if they would walk towards the feet, it would zoom in to the feet of the figures. If they walk towards the middle of the body, same thing. And no one ever figured that out, but on the other hand, as I said, using randomness up to that point, one of the things that randomness does is it doesn't, it feels random, and it doesn't kind of tie everything together. So for me, these kind of hidden methods that have meaning behind them or reasons behind them are kind of a better way to go for interactive works. And as you would move around the bed, it would actually pan the bodies again because it was responding to your kind of left-right location. I don't think anyone ever figured that out, but again, it was just a way of dealing with non-randomness. So those last two works I showed were I kind of call anti-interactive works because you got exactly what you didn't want from them. You tried to see more and you could see less. The next stage of works that I did I call dead interactive works. If I can get rid of that somehow. Yeah. Maybe if I do that and then close it. Oh well. I guess I'll leave that there for a little while. So at this point, I took all of the technology that I'd been using for interactivity and I created a series of works that were not interactive, but again, used the technology. So this series is called the Memory Works. And I took, they all have the same structure. They have an aluminum box, kind of an enclosure that holds the memory of something, and the electronic memory. And then a representation of that memory kind of is put up on the wall, modulated by the electronic memory. So the work on the left is called A Photo of My Mother, and it's modulated by a recording of my breathing. So her image comes and goes based on a recording of my breath, not a sound recording, but a pressure recording. So for these works, I used a lot of different kinds of sensors. For me, it was, these also are kind of analogies for human memory, where a memory is kind of this is called Portrait of My Father, and it's modulated by my, a recording of my heartbeat. Again, not a sound recording, but a EKG. The notion with these works is that, like human memory, they're kind of this meta thing where, you know, I have something in my head that I'm trying to communicate, and there's a million different ways of doing that. I can jump up and down to try to communicate it. I can write a book to try to communicate it. But that memory itself cannot be perfectly expressed or idea. And these are kind of digital versions of that. So each of the digital memories can be expressed many different ways. This work's called I Have Never Read the Bible, and that's a Webster's dictionary. And what you hear when you walk up to it is me reading the Bible one letter at a time. And of course, I didn't read the whole Bible one letter at a time. All I did was read the alphabet, and then the electronic memory of the Bible said, say this letter now, say this letter now, say this letter now. And this is the same concept, actually an earlier work, but it was two, so I did the Bible one. This is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech being typed. And again, I didn't actually type the I Have a Dream speech. I just typed the 26 keys of the typewriter. And then the electronic text of his speech said, play this sound now, play this sound now. Work on the left is called her the cyclical meter and cyclical counter. This is a woman breathing for, I think it's a 1 hour period. So the clock, instead of representing time, is representing kind of the flow of air coming out of this, from this woman. And that was a continuous clock, and this is called cyclical counter, and it's actually counting her blinking over the same period. So using the two different types of clocks, one as a kind of a continuous meter and the other one as as a discrete meter. And this one's called Anonymous Photograph of an Electrocution. And what I did was I recorded power line fluctuations in the wall and amplified them. So like when your refrigerator goes on and your lights dim a little bit. And I did that on a day when there was an execution happening in Texas. And the last one of these is called Sand, and it's I wore an accelerometer on my foot on the beach, and so what you see is kind of a representation of the memory of the sand on my feet. So in 1996, I had to give a lecture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I'd only been doing art about 5 or 6 years at that point, and I was scared shitless, basically. So I spent about 6 months preparing for it and looked at the state of kind of interactive art at that point. And what I did was I kind of came up with this formula for interactive art at the time, where you have these input sensors, you have very minimal algorithms, and then you have representations. And 95% of kind of interactive art at the time could fit into this formula. And of course what it did was, since I came up with a formula for it, was I decided that I didn't want to do it anymore if it was that formulaic. And so it was one of the things that actually led to me stopping doing interactive art, was this kind of way of really describing it in such a simple way. Unfortunately, sometimes students go to my website and they think that that's actually a real formula and think it's a good thing and use it. But for me, it was a criticism. And this is a good example of fits into the model I was just showing, where you have an input sensor and an output representation. I had a camera pointed at this candle inside the Brooklyn Bridge. It was a project with Creative Time. And every minute fluctuation of the candle, just from people walking in the space, would create a very loud wind sound that I use an audio amplifier to create. So even though there was almost no wind in the space, it sounded like there was a kind of a giant windstorm. What was most interesting and I think successful about this work for me was the fact that it crossed senses. In other words, I didn't look at the candle light and light the whole space, amplifying the light. I looked at the candle light and created a sound from that. I started thinking about pixels and digital images. And this was one of the earlier works. It's called Color by Number. And what you see, these two kind of James Turrell-like color fields with changing colors, in this case in a hallway. And the installation was set up so that you could actually walk behind the color fields and look at these squares as they had video projectors projecting onto them. And directly across from each of these square lights was a small LCD screen with a static image with a single pixel slowly scanning across. And what you realize when you're standing there is that this big color field that's now behind you is being generated by the kind of the location of this pixel as it's slowly scanning this static image. I think it took about an hour and a half to scan the whole image. And there were two of them, one on each side. The kind of thought for this work was that when you were in the room looking at the single pixel being surrounded by the color, as it would kind of pull you in, and it would almost be like you were that pixel. Variation of that work is called Experiments in Touching Color, where it's a pedestal with an image on it that you put your hand down onto, and as you touch the image, it disappears. Another work that kind of is connected to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. By the way, so I'm sure many of you know what it is, but very simply what Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says is that if you try to measure something or even try to look at something, you'll change it. Nothing exists kind of in its pure form. So just the process of observing changes. So in this case, the sound, when the image fades away, the sound comes on. So you're actually touching the image that you can no longer see, and the middle finger there is the color that you're choosing. I wanted to create an interactive work that had no goal, that was completely non-game oriented, and this was kind of the attempt at doing that. It was more about exploration when you were interacting with it than it was about kind of finding or looking for something. The reason the sound comes on when the video goes out is that it gives you a few more kind of cues or clues as to what the image is doing, since you can no longer see it. Let's see if I can get rid of that thing somewhere else. Does anybody know how to get rid of this damn thing? Well, I am going to restart. I'm sorry. So, starting around 2000, I started thinking about working with very small amounts of information and what could be done with very small amounts of information. And I got a grant from a Canadian company to the Langlois Foundation, a Canadian foundation, to do some experiments with very low resolution pixelated images. And that's kind of the where I headed next. Let's not make that happen again. So in 1996, I guess, I got my first color graphics card. Before that, it was just amber and green, and it was the first time I actually saw video images or even still images on a computer screen. And one of the things that I realized when I got that computer card was that, in fact, I woke up in the middle of the night, and it's actually a true story, with a cold sweat, realizing that once you move to digital images, there's only a finite number of them. And completely not having some background in film and photography, not something that I ever would have thought of, though I guess you could argue it's true with those also. So I actually got out my calculator and I calculated how many images there are that are, say, 640 by 480 in color. And it really being a math major, upset me that that was finite. It was kind of like, where's God? And so I created this work, which is the most boring work I've ever created, but it really, the notion was really changing from my way of thinking about art. And the work generates all possible images. So any image that you can imagine, whether it's an image of your birth or your death, will eventually show up on this screen. Doesn't matter that it will take more time than has ever existed, but it is finite, and that was kind of the part that made me want to move away from the digital. So I started thinking about how information gets into and out of a computer. And one of the things that happens in that process is information is lost. And I decided to focus on this thing called a reconstruction filter, which takes digital information as it leaves the computer and it filters it so that it's more analog, to make it analog. This is a famous image of Abraham Lincoln, done at Bell Labs in the early 70s. And it was kind of one of the inspirations for moving into working with low resolution. One of the things that I realized was that that is one representation of the digital data. This is a second representation of exactly the same data. So you can take a series of numbers and represent an image, in this case, that looks completely different just by filtering it differently. And in those cases, those are different forms of reconstruction filters. So that led me to creating my own low-resolution display devices using LEDs. This is a very early one called Running Falling, and it's just a figure that's eternally running as fast as he can and falling. And I'm showing it here with and without a diffusing screen. One of the things early on that I realized when I was experimenting with these low-resolution images was that when your brain was looking at the little blinking lights, the little blinking lights were actually noise to your brain in terms of understanding what it is that you're looking at. So I did a number of works that use filters so they're low resolution. For example, that one was 800 pixels. This one is only 88 pixels. It's a boxing match, and it's in color, so there's actually more information there. But by filtering out the pixel structure, the digital structure, then the information is more comprehensible by our brain. And that's slightly backwards, because you would think that by taking something away you would see less. But in this case, by taking away that structure, you're able to comprehend what you're looking at. This is 88 pixels, and it's really at the limit of perceivability. It took some people about 10 minutes to realize what they were looking at, until they read the title or until it finally hit them. And of course, once they realized what they were looking at, then from then on, they would see it, forever. This work defines an image just by its perimeter. It was actually the first work I made, and one of the reasons that it is in that form is because those LEDs were very expensive, and that way I only had to kind of describe the outer edge of the image versus describing the whole image. It's called a fire, a freeway, and a walk. And it's so abstract that if you don't know if you really need to read the title to see the kind of the three images that go by. One of the things that I became interested in after looking at these kinds of works and making these kinds of works for many years was what I call kind of a primal perception. And what I mean by that is there's not enough information in these works, there's not enough details to have the analytical part of your brain interpret them. So essentially the analytical part of your brain shuts off. And this kind of allows a flowing of the movement and the color and the shape and the form in kind of subliminal ways. This was another experiment in looking at diffusing screens. The diffusing screen is very close to the LEDs on the left and very far on the right. So the image, as you're looking at it, the figures are kind of walking back and forth between a digital representation and an analog representation. And again, you can't really tell that much about these people other than the way that they move. Early on, I realized that these works, let me pause this and you'll see what I mean. These works are decipherable by our brain only because they're moving. For example, here you have a running figure, and if I freeze it, you have a black blob. And so the information that you're getting from these works that's telling you what the image is in the movement of the image. And I found that early on when I tried to photograph the early works, and 99 out of 100 pictures would come out with just black blobs on the screen. This is from a series called Motion and Rest, and it's 6 different disabled people walking and their gaits. And if you look closely and squint your eyes, you can actually see this woman's crutches as they're kind of going up and down in front of her. And for me, this was the first time, it was maybe 2 years in, that the medium, the technology, and the content came together. Here you have these people, and the medium distills their gait, getting rid of kind of who they are in any other way, their clothes, their age, their gender. It's a distillation of their movement, and the medium itself does that. Yeah.
How are these displayed? Are they
This is kind of like a painting. It's just got a wire in the back and it hangs on a nail. And it's about 2 feet wide, 2.5 feet wide. Yes, and you need distance to see what to actually see them. Typically, distance has the same effect as the filtering technique. It kind of eliminates the pixel structure. Another work that also hangs on the wall about the same size, called Wave Modulation, that looks at, I kind of took that notion, if these works are defined by their movement, what would happen if I took an image like of ocean waves here and over a 10-minute period gradually slowed it down until it stopped. If it were a video and I were doing that, it would go from essentially a moving image to a still image of ocean waves. But because it's low resolution, and I'm not going to make you watch the whole 10 minutes, but it's showing different segments along that 10-minute period. Because it's low resolution, it goes from representational to abstract. Because when it's not moving, you just have no idea what it is that you're looking at. And that's only because it's low resolution. If that was a real ocean wave, it would look like a photograph of an ocean wave. So in a funny kind of way, these works have a lot in common with sound. If you take a sound, sound is defined by movement. If you take a sound and you slow it down, it becomes abstract because it's defined by the movement. If you take these works and you slow them down, they become abstract for the same reason, because they're defined by movement. So that was kind of a proof for me that it was true. And this work, which was the first work that uses this reverse technology, there's a similar work in the collection of the museum here that also relates to Heisenberg. The pixels, instead of facing out, are facing the wall, and so you're looking at the image as it's being projected onto the wall, kind of pixel by pixel. But there's no way of actually seeing the image without it being obscured by the display device that's creating it. These are from home movies found on eBay. And that work is about 4 feet by 6 feet. And each of those little squares, which is a light that faces the wall, is about 1.5 inches. I looked at about 200 hours of eBay home movies, and the shocking thing was, over a 40 or 50 year period, every one of them was exactly alike. They were all Easter and birthday parties in Niagara Falls, Grand Canyon. For this next work, I took this same technology just because I had it, and it allowed me to create a work that was essentially peripheral vision that you could look straight at. So there's a higher resolution of pixels on the left, and I think there's about 60 vertically, and on the right there's about 6 or 7 vertically. So the image goes from high resolution to low resolution, which is what our peripheral vision does. And so this was kind of a way of creating a work that doesn't use your peripheral vision, but it kind of describes peripheral vision. And for me, sticking a camera out the window of a car was the way to do that. That's where our peripheral vision is most active, because of all the movement going by as you're zipping down the road. So this is back to the running falling figure. This is 200 pixels. This is the same running falling figure with 48 pixels. And if I tell you it's a running falling figure, you might be able to tell. But probably not. And this is the same image with 1 pixel running falling figure. And so that led me, thinking about that, led me to this next work, which is called Last Day in the Beginning of March, which is also actually in the collection of the museum here. It's showed at the Matrix Gallery. And I kind of took the notion, the challenge of what can you represent with just a single light. And so the work is again, Last Day in the Beginning of March. It's I see it as a visual poem about the last day of my brother's life. So it's a room that you walk into. I think this rhythm is labeled Walking Back and Forth. It's a room that you walk into that has a series of about 3-foot circles projected onto the ground. And each circle has a little label near it telling you what that rhythm of light is. So it's essentially a symphony of dynamic lights, each going at their own rhythm, that you walk around in this big space to see and to feel. And this is a good example of a work that I wouldn't call it, if you experience this work, it's not really a work of visual art, because you walk in this space and you don't really look at anything. It's really about just feeling, being there. So here you're seeing 25 different rhythms that define events from that day. For example, things like the car radio in his car, or his heartbeat, or the telephone ringing, or this is the windshield wipers on his car. And so just the little clues of the text tell you what each of the rhythms are. And together they kind of define I think this one is called telephone. Together they define, again, or help describe that day. And one of the things that was challenging about that work is I started out thinking that for all of the rhythms that I wanted to create, I would record them. And then I realized that by trying to record the rhythms, they didn't actually imply what I wanted them to imply. So I showed the one drawing earlier. So I drew the rhythms over on a graph over time, and that allowed me to kind of tune them so that they would evoke what I was interested in them evoking, because a sensor didn't necessarily do that. Okay, let's move to public art here. So I've used the same kind of low resolution technology for a number of public artworks. This is a work that last I heard the area was under construction, but it has been at UCSF for about 10 years on the Parnassus campus. And it's this glass wall of an image that is made up of 49 cubes. And each of what I did was I essentially sliced out, I took out the 7 middle cubes and spread them throughout the garden. And they're tied to the rhythms of the waves in real time. So instead of just looking at this wall of this image of the ocean waves, the whole garden kind of dances minimally with the rhythm of the waves. It was a cost-effective way of dealing with a very large space, but on the other hand, as you can see, that kind of minimal representation is as minimal as possible is something that I've been fascinated with. This is the work that Jeffrey mentioned, that was in Madison Square Park in New York for 6 months. It was made up of about 1,400 light bulbs that were modified and had LEDs put in them. And in a three-dimensional grid, but at nighttime when you looked at these kind of swinging lights, they would kind of resolve to make an image of figures from Grand Central Station. And this work, we were very nervous that 2 days after we installed it, every bulb would break. But as it turned out, it would blow 12, 15 feet at a time, but it would tend to blow together. So it actually survived with only 400 bulbs breaking over a 6-month period. This is a work that is at San Diego Airport. It's a 750-foot long kind of virtual ribbon. There are, I think, 36,000 individually suspended glass spheres that together kind of create an image above your head as you're walking down the concourse. The challenge here was how to, and this is a good slide for it, how to, our renderings, as they always are, or always have been for me and a lot of public artists, you kind of ignore a lot of what you're going to need to do until the end. So our renderings for 2 years were basically anti-gravity. We had all these spheres up there floating in space with nothing supporting them. So once we actually had to build it, we had to try to come up with a way to get rid of the wires up above. And so we had a custom wire made that was as small as possible and was reinforced with Kevlar and was gray. So it kind of blended into the aluminum panels above. And if you see this work, it actually, I wouldn't say it feels anti-gravity, but the wires almost go away. Just kind of a field of mist above the works. And this shows swimmers and also birds at times flying kind of back and forth. Another thing I noticed watching that work for a long time was how adults almost never notice it because they're in a hurry, and I constantly see little kids doing this and their parents kind of just dragging their kids. It's actually pretty funny. I was given this building, which is normally used for advertising, not to put up my own lighting structure, but to put artwork up on this building that again is normally advertising. So I just sent them a file. I didn't do anything for the building itself. They wanted to try working with an artist. Hong Kong. It's the ICC building. So it was up for 2 months, basically. They gave me the building for 2 months to do the imagery that I wanted to do. It's the tallest building in Hong Kong. Each one of those lights is a floor. But what was amazing about this technologically for me and shocking is that, and I use it in a work, those lights are probably only about 2 inches high. So you have 2 inches every 15 feet. And that's enough to have kind of this continuity of a resolved image. I was completely shocked by that. But not too shocked to copy it. The University of Hong Kong talked them into working with artists, and then after I did it, they started working with the students from the university, which was exciting. This is a work that is in the Civic Center in Des Moines, and it's called Swirl, and it's about 10 tons of stainless steel ellipses kind of elevated up 30 feet high with an eternal image of the marathon, Des Moines marathon runners. running around and around and around kind of forever on this sculpture. This work was a challenge for a number of reasons. One is that it's a circular image, but there's a second is that there's an image on the inside and the outside. Here I'm simulating what it looks like from far away by blurring it. And this is the work that this work is up now actually, still. It's a collaboration with somebody I've collaborated a lot with, Benjamin Bergerie. And it's called Jacob's Dream, and it's essentially these tubes of LED strips that are wrapped in rice paper to create this 45-foot ladder that shows figures constantly ascending and descending. This work resolves from very far away, but it also resolves from very close when you look almost directly underneath at all of the vertical gaps go away, and it just becomes a continuous image. They have an artist in residency program where they do artworks once a year, and they've kept this up for a year and a half or so now. Yeah. It's pretty close to the front door. And this last work is this a work in progress that Jeffrey mentioned that I am hopefully wrapping up in the next month or so. The top 9 floors of the Salesforce Tower. Let me pause it here. So the top 6 floors that you're looking at are perforated aluminum. And then below that, the lower 3 floors are glass. And all 9 floors are open to the elements up there. The glass area is mechanical, air conditioners and pumps and things. And the top 6 aluminum floors, or aluminum coated floors, are actually just purely aesthetic. It was a change to Caesar Pelli's design based on feedback from the city not liking the way the top of the tower top looked. So they added 6 stories that they didn't need to add for any reason other than aesthetics. And so they had a call for finding an artist to work with these 6 floors up there. And they kind of knew from the beginning that Caesar Pelli's office that they were interested in maybe doing something. They definitely knew they wanted light, and they thought maybe they wanted imagery also. So they had a large competition, and I won the competition for creating an artwork for the top. And we've been working on it almost 4 years now. So this is a rendering, and the technology that I'm using for this work is essentially the curtain work that I showed earlier, where the LEDs are actually facing in. So there's 12,000 LEDs on stems, on 6-inch stems mounted to the outside of the building facing in. And what that does is it softens the imagery essentially. If there were 12,000 lights facing out, it would feel more like Times Square. So instead of having them face out, I'm facing them in by softening them to soften them. if it looks this good, I'll be happy. Again, I've been working on it 4 years, and I haven't seen how it's going to look yet. But we're going to do some image testing next week. And that last work is really, I would say, in some ways, the most challenging, certainly the most challenging public work that I have done. Not so much of the technology, though that was challenging too. As you can imagine, 12,000 waterproof pixels all wired together at the top took a lot. But there's no precedent really for kind of the urban design aspect of helping to define a skyline with an image. And so I was telling Jeffrey before, the Boston Properties, who's the developer, is essentially giving me a year to figure out what works up there and what doesn't. Because there's nothing I can look to. I mean, I certainly wouldn't look to Times Square, or I wouldn't look to Hong Kong, which is kind of overwhelming with media. So it's really a big challenge to understand what an image to define a skyline is. Typical 101 public art, as many of you know and would agree or disagree with, is you look at the local community and you look at the history of the immediate area and you make sure you respond to those things. In this case, there is no local community, there is no immediate area. You have to be half a mile away to see it. So it just completely changes kind of the paradigm of what it should be. And so we have cameras throughout the city, 8 cameras throughout the city that will be capturing images during the day, like a cloud camera or a surf camera, all abstract, or a pedestrian camera at the Embarcadero, and then playing back those images that night. And the kind of 3 metaphors that we've used over the last 3 years to think about the project are a clock tower, a beacon, and the last one, which really relates to the cameras, is somehow a pulse of the city without making it red and green around Christmas time. So, questions? Yes.
Other pieces have been more unintentionally making people angry, and what pieces those were.
I did I guess, as I said, I didn't really go to art school, and I didn't really have many friends who were artists, so I wasn't really aware of the notion of not contriving an artwork for a response. And for me, those 3 works were kind of contrived for a response. And since then, meeting many people from the Art Institute who were kind of conceptual thinkers, I kind of learned about, learned different ways of thinking about work, and started more making work for myself and then putting it out there. And if people like it, they do. If they don't, they don't. I had some mental illness in my family, and I had made a film about it a couple years earlier, and I was pretty angry. There are 2 themes that have come up a lot in my work. One is disability, and the other is mental illness. Both of them kind of come from personal experiences. And both of them, I've been angry at times, obviously, at how our culture treats both people with disabilities or people with mental illness. And so they were responses to that, again, to try to get people to empathize at, it could be this painful. Unfortunately, as I said, it's a little kids waving at the camera. It didn't work, but anyway, I don't know if I answered your question.
How do you negotiate between the notion of planning and designing your pieces down to specifications and things like that, and being expressive and spontaneous in your work, where you get to express your ideas and thoughts and things like that?
Expressive and or spontaneous with public art, at least for me, the way that I work, I don't do intervention public art. I do city-sponsored public art or airport-sponsored. So there's zero spontaneity there, that's for sure. I mean, it's this has been a 4-year process for this work. There's sometimes the technology, I'll have an idea for a technology, and I won't know what will go on that technology. And other times, like the home movie Curtain Works, that kind of all just came together at the same time. But for example, for the low resolution wall works, I now have kind of, I can go grab one from my studio and I can load new imagery in it. So that gives me the freedom to try anything new on that versus the Des Moines sculpture, which took, again, 2 years to fabricate and not really know what kind of imagery would even work at the end. So I couldn't even think about that in the beginning. So I do get bogged down in the technology, partially because of the process and partially because I'm a nerdy engineer, half nerdy engineer. So, yeah. Permanent for public art, typically, at least these kinds of things, say 20 years. So yes, they're talking about it as being permanent. Yes.
I wonder if you could say something about your work moving from in the gallery, where it is, you can spend as much time as you want with it and choose to look at it or not look at it, to this skyscraper size work, and your feeling maybe of responsibility as an artist to what you put up on it. I mean, it seems like gallery work people choose to come see, and this is not ignorable. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that as a creator.
That is exactly the way that I describe this work. Is 1 million people will see it every night, whether they want to or not, and that's a lot of pressure, if you will. I make again, I was talking to Jeffrey earlier. I make a big distinction between doing gallery art and doing public art. The gallery art, I can be self-indulgent. I can be kind of too extreme on one end. And with public art, I make a commitment from the beginning that it's the Hollywood sell your soul model, to do something that people will like. That doesn't mean that I will do something that I don't like, but it means I take that into consideration, which for me I've always seen as a polluting part of the artistic process. But I also think it's good for me to not just do the more self-indulgent, to actually think about how people will respond and what the non-art audience will get from something. So I do feel, actually, for this piece in particular, for whatever reason, a really large responsibility. Not to have people like it, but I guess to have me like it, to think it's successful for what it's trying to do. I call it the big experiment in the sky, because we don't know what's going to work up there. And we're hopefully going to see images for the first time after 4 years next week, so we'll see if I'm alive in 2 weeks.
Have you been thinking about how this project works in conversation with the Bay Lights project on the Bay Bridge?
A little bit, not a lot. I mean, one of the interesting things when you start using recognizable imagery is that people can't, and the more recognizable it is, the more true this is that people will get sick of it. It's like a loop. Even if I have different cameras, it's still ocean waves that it's showing. And that is a concern that I have, because I'm not really interested in making a TV set up there that shows, you know, something new every night. I'm more interested in kind of ritual. So one of the things I thought about is the Bay Bridge, in a way, is a little easier because it's completely abstract. And so people don't have that question that are going to start coming to me after a week, which is, when are you going to change the imagery? And so those are the kinds of things I've looked at, kind of what's successful about it and what's not, and one of the criticisms of it. So that's one of the successful things, is people don't have that sick of it notion, because it's abstract. And the maybe one of the things that it has been criticized for, again, which is something that I've thought about, not so much with regard to it, but you know, how that criticism would make sense with my work, is its relevancy. Is it, what does it have to do with the city? And the answer is nothing, I think. And so I need to make sure that I don't have an answer of nothing for my work. So I do think about what has worked about it and what hasn't worked, and how I can kind of respond to that in my work. In terms of the aesthetic balance, not really. I've kind of, it is what it is. I've been given that. I'm not saying that once we start looking at imagery up there, I won't change the imagery because something clashes with the other. It might. But ahead of time, that's not really anything that I could think about. Yeah. In the meantime, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about the your shift kind of from the art in the gallery to the art that's more in the public. I kind of see also a shift in the projection screen, like from like a flat surface and like a square to now more like spherical shapes, or like more like not just this traditional rectangular kind of projection. So I'm wondering if that also means that your view on perspective maybe has changed, or if that's just because the perspective of us as viewers to the art in the public has changed.
There are works that are similar to the or closer to the public work in that they're more sculptural, that I didn't show, that are kind of gallery works, if you want to call them that. They definitely kind of feed each other. I mean, the Des Moines project in particular, the one with the ellipses, for me was the first time that, and we made a big effort for that, not being a sculptor in terms of training or anything. It was to have the work function as something during the day also. It wasn't just a big empty vehicle for lights. And so that is one of the things that I think about for public art now, is this needs to make sense. And actually it's true for San Diego too. You can turn the piece off and it still is this kind of rhythmic ribbon. I don't know, it's just think about the things differently. There's kind of different set of a much harsher set of restrictions and requirements for the public art, and so I don't know if I've answered your question, but but they do feed each other, and the physical aspect of the public work is generally not as hideable as they are in the gallery. For example, you know, we constantly hide things in the wall or things like that.
Yeah, okay.
I'm really interested in the first work that you showed and how it relates to mental illness. Can you go a little bit more into it and how it does?
I mean, yeah, it's all in the title. It's hallucination. The person I knew who was mentally ill in particular felt like he has spiders crawling on his body commonly. And so I just chose to do the kind of metaphor of flames, feeling like your body's on fire. So it was just a literal kind of psychotic hallucination was the kind of the goal, the thought behind making the work. Did that answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just curious because initially your art or your work came from like a story, and a lot of times people get inspiration from their story or personal experiences, but I wasn't sure with technology, like how do you get inspired to like work on something? Like, does it come from you being a nerdy engineer, like studying physics on a certain area, like, oh, this is new, let me try this? Like, I was just curious where that comes from.
Historically, it's come from both. I've made the first LED low resolution display devices having no idea what I was going to put on them. And then, as I said, it was 2 years later when I added the story of the disabled people walking to those works. So I think that the technology gets in the way of the stories a lot. There's no question that happens. And that's partially because of who I am and partially because of the time that it takes to do the technology, to create the technology. And so it goes both ways in terms of what comes first, what's going in the technology or the technology itself. Being an engineer, it's one of the things that early on I did maybe a little less than other people. I didn't really fetishize the technology because it was just what I did in Silicon Valley. So it's, so I just used it for what it was.
Sorry, just a bit of a follow-up question to the Salesforce building. As an artist, do you feel a responsibility to respond to the accusation that the building looks very phallic?
Do I feel no, but that brings up an interesting story. The piece that I did in Hong Kong, one of the students, after I had the piece up for a few weeks and I was back in Hong Kong, said to me, you really should have just shut the building off as your statement, because that is the most light polluted block on the planet. And I didn't know that. But they wouldn't have let me shut the building off anyway. I personally, my favorite metaphor is the missile. So I probably won't respond to the missile or the penis.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had sole and complete control of the images displayed on the Salesforce building.
Good question. That took 2 months of negotiation in the contract process, and yes, I do.
And is that for a certain period of time?
What I told them early on for this project was that, and it's kind of specific to what I do, is that I'm designing the technology, we're putting the technology up there, and we're putting imagery on the technology. If you want to put a big display device up there and hire me as an artist to give you some footage, I can do that, and then you can have it the rest of the time. But if you're hiring me to do the whole thing, you can't have it. And so finally, after it was literally like 2 months, I said to them that, there's not an artist in the United States that would let you put Salesforce logos up there. So don't ask me to do that. And they stopped after that. It wasn't Salesforce, by the way. It's Boston Properties. Salesforce is just the name. And since then, I have to say, they've been fantastic about that control, if you want to call it that. And they do have there's some offensive stuff in the contract that the imagery can't be offensive, but they can't just tell me that they don't want to show because they don't like it.
Okay, but that work is basically protected from advertisements.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. So seeing that you're like from the Bay Area and you do like lots of light works, especially like in public, I'm sure that it uses a lot of watts and energy. Have you ever thought about incorporating the idea of sustainability into any of your pieces?
Yeah, I'm actually doing a piece in the Tenderloin that is going up, it's the Tenderloin Development, TNDC, I forgot what it stands for. But it's on Mission Street near 7th, and I'm doing a work that they didn't have enough money to do the infrastructure for what I wanted to do, so we're designing a piece on the side of a wall that is about 30 feet by 15 feet up high that will have both solar powered and wireless pixels. So all they had to do for the building is put a bunch of nuts embedded in the concrete, and we'll be screwing in our solar powered pixel. From the beginning, I've tried to, LEDs are inherently really efficient. For example, the work that I did in Madison Square Park, we had briefly considered doing that with real light bulbs, and we would have had to rent a semi-truck generator for 2 months to do that. And instead of that, because we sawed apart the light bulbs and we put LEDs inside, the whole sculpture took about as much as a toaster oven.
Hi, yeah. I'm really intrigued by what you've been doing in terms of perception, specifically with the different things that respond to like movement and things like that. And I know a lot of your work has kind of focused on what you can show with one bit of information or one light of information. And so I'm wondering if you've also consciously played with what you're doing in terms of the response, in terms of like one cell's response, like the retinal ganglion cells, and how they might respond to movement or certain orientations, and if you've ever kind of played with it mirroring back the other way.
No.
Okay.
But perception, and what I talked about earlier, that notion, and it's kind of a big pretentious phrase, but primal perception is really what I'm interested in. There's you probably know what blind sight is, but blind sight is this, got very excited when I heard about it because it kind of fits in with some of the stuff that I was thinking about. But there's certain kind of blindness, you could probably describe it better than me, that people have a degenerative disease and they go completely blind, but they can test them and they can say, what color is this? And the person will say, I don't know what color that is. Why are you asking me? I'm blind. And then they say, guess. And there's a certain number of, certain type of blindness where people can guess 100% of the time. So, sorry, my mouth's getting dry. So they're perceiving what color it is without knowing that they're perceiving. So it's kind of what I was saying, a more direct path, a less analytical path through their senses into their brain. Thank you.